Before we start creating our first virtual machine, let's take a look at the tools that we have at hand for this. Now, I'm going to start off with PowerShell, although I'm going to demonstrate most things in the graphical just because the initial concepts sometimes are easier to understand. Certainly when you want to start doing this in scale across multiple hosts, or if you want to automate this process, you're going to want to do it with PowerShell. So what happened was when we installed the role, we also installed the PowerShell commandlets for this. And here's a couple of different ways on how you can find them. Now, I'm going to start off by using GetHelp, the normal discovery tool, and just tell you that I'm going to look for everything that begins with a VM. Here's what I already know that I want to share with you, is that the nouns of these commandlets are prefixed with VM. In fact, I can make this search even better by putting in a dash, since I know it's a prefix. I can hit enter, and there you get a list of them. That's a pretty long list of commandlets, and you can do everything with the commandlets that we're going to do with the graphical, even more. So the commandlets are definitely something you want to use. Let me show you another way to get this list. Over here is the module that these commandlets are coming from. So what I'm going to do is use get command and have it just list the module Hyper-V. Now I'm going to format this. On my screen resolution, I want it to look pretty, and so we can see all the columns. And here's the list of all the commandlets once again. And I'm going to just quickly scroll to the top here so you can see what the column headers are. Now, it's interesting to note that these commandlets did not exist until Server 2012 came out, and like Server 2012, Server 2012 R2 has them as well. Now, if you come from an environment where you've been working with VMware, you know that you have PowerShell commandlets been around for a very long time with PowerCLI. This is similar now in that you have all of the management capabilities through PowerShell. In fact, let's take a look at how many of them we currently have. 182, that's plenty to get started with. Now, when you add something like System Center Virtualization, Machine Manager, you're obviously going to get more capabilities, that kind of thing. Well, now that we've done PowerShell, let's take a look at the graphical. I'm going to start here in Server Manager, and this is where I'm going to launch the tool. And the tool is the Hyper-V Manager. So right here is Hyper-V Manager. And the first thing I'm going to do, especially on this host, is I'm going to pin this so I don't have to keep going into Server Manager every time I want to get to it. I like to have it pinned to the taskbar. And I'll go ahead and close Server Manager. And this will be the graphical tool that we use. Let me go ahead and expand it. Just as a quick look before we create our first virtual machine, I want you to notice over here, if I select Hyper-V Manager, you can have this connect to multiple servers so that you can manage different servers. And here's the server that we're going to manage. This would be my host. And right now you can see it gives you a list of the virtual machines, if there's any checkpoints, which we'll talk about, and the details of that. There are no virtual machines yet or guest operating systems that we've created on this box. But I will bet that you can already tell where we're going to go to start to create a virtual machine. So what do you say we create our first virtual machine? We'll go over to New, say Virtual Machine. And it comes up with a wizard that'll help us create this, and it'll take us through the steps of what we're going to do. So we'll click Next. And the first thing is to give the name to this virtual machine. And I like to give it what kind of role this virtual machine would be. Is it going to be a file server? Is it going to be a server running a database like SQL? That kind of thing. In my case, we're going to call this server number 1. Pretty simple virtual machine name. Now, below that is where you put in the path of where you want the virtual machine stored. And it's grayed out right now, but let me click this as if I was going to change it. This will be the location that it's going to put it. This location came from when we were installing the role, that default location that we created for it. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at this default location rather than change it to a different one. We'll click Next. And now it comes up with a conversation here. And this is a conversation that we need to have. Do you want a Generation 1 or a Generation 2 virtual machine? And if you're thinking to yourself, well, Gen 2 sounds better, you're right. So I obviously will want Gen 2. Well, not necessarily. And this is what we want to be a little bit careful about. First of all, you'll see by the warning that's on the screen, once you've created this, you can't change it. So you've got to choose your options wisely. Now, Generation 1 machine is the older type. It is compatible with older virtual machines, and it has some characteristics in it that you may still need. It has an x86 BIOS that is set up in it. It also still supports the legacy IDE controllers and network adapters, things like floppy drives. When you go to Generation 2, those things are not supported. In other words, things change. Generation 2 is a little bit more flexible in the hardware that you can use because it uses a unified extensible firmware interface as opposed to a BIOS. This means you get a much wider range of CPU architectures, and how you want to handle the boot process is a great example. You can PXE boot from Gen 2 VMs. Now, the PXE boot is also a secured boot. It's always secured so that it prevents something like somebody injecting something during the boot process. You can also boot from SCSI virtual disks and, like I said, the PXE environment. Now, Gen 2s are only supported in Server 2012 and Server 2012 R2, but they're also supported, as we'll mention a little bit later on, in Windows 8.1, where, oh, and you can see it right there, Windows 8.1, where we can have the client-side Hyper-V. There's a few other things that the Gen 2s don't support, such as COM ports, if you needed COM ports. And there's a technology that we're going to talk about a little bit later that Gen 2s don't use called Remote FX. Now, other than that, Gen 2s do provide you with a lot of great capabilities. We'll be talking about this with storage, the new VHDXs, and the fact that you can resize your virtual hard drives and you can have files up larger than 64 terabytes on those. And Gen 2s will support up to 8 network adapters. So there's a lot of benefits to Gen 2. On this first VM that I'm going to make, I'm going to go ahead and make it a Gen 2. And I'll click Next. Now, how much memory do you want? We're going to come back a little bit later and talk about dynamic memory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it a certain amount of memory to run with. Now, the particular server that I'm building is going to be a pretty small one. So I'm going to give him 1024 megabytes. I know that seems really small for a server. That'll be a core box, something like that. Once the memory has been assigned, I need to assign the networking. And I want you to notice that right now we haven't done anything to configure our networking yet in the virtual network settings. So I can either have him at not connected or take the virtual switch that was created. I'm going to go ahead and do that, but we'll come back and look at additional networking stuff. When we come up to the virtual hard disk, this is going to create the definition for the virtual hard disk, and it comes up and it gives us some options here. How do you want us to handle the virtual hard disk itself? Do you want us to go ahead and create it? Notice, since I got a Gen 2, it's a VHDX called Server 1, and it shows the location that it's going to put it. Again, that's the location that we decided on when we installed the role. We can change it, and by default, it's going to be a dynamic disk, and it can grow to 127 gigabytes. And notice it gives us that maximum of 64 terabytes. Now, this is if I want to create a new virtual hard disk. We have some other options here. You might already have a virtual hard disk. Maybe you moved a VHDX from one box to another, and you're just creating a new definition for it, and you would like to launch it. You can also decide to, I want to create it and attach it later. Right now, I'm just going to let him make the virtual hard disk. And here we're getting towards the end of the wizard where we need to decide how we're going to get the operating system on this virtual machine. I can install it later. I can install the operating system from a bootable image, such as an ISO, which is what I'm going to choose, or I can do a PXE boot installation. So I'm going to choose an ISO, and I happen to know that out here, Greg gave me some ISOs from earlier when he was doing his server install. I'm going to grab one of those ISOs, and I'll hit Next. It'll give me a summary of everything that I'm creating, and I can click Finish, and I will have my new virtual machine. Now, it doesn't start the virtual machine right away, and we can do that. And since we've given it an ISO, it'll start the operation of installing the operating system. So here is where the virtual machine is located, right there. And it gives us some basic information: when it was created, what version, what generation, any notes that were entered, whether it's clustered, and you have some tabs down here that we'll be using occasionally to monitor its memory. See that it's got 1024 dynamics disabled, what networking I have set up for it, and if I have any replication for it. In our case, I'm going to go ahead and start this virtual machine just so you can see. I'm going to go to right-click on it and say Start. And as it's starting, it's showing me what CPU usage it's having, what its uptime and status is. And you can see down here, it's giving me a display of it. I'm going to double click on it, and this will take us into a connection session. Oh, look, he's getting ready to boot from CD. I happened to hit the space bar so that he would go to the ISO image. And now it's going to start the installation of the server operating system. And we don't need to go through this because Greg took us through this earlier. I would go through and complete this, and that would begin my usage of this virtual machine. And that's all there is to it. Well, not exactly. I'm going to go ahead and close this window, and you don't have to worry. By closing this, it doesn't actually turn off the virtual machine, although you can right click and make those decisions on your own here to turn it off or shut it down. And we'll talk more about checkpointing. We're not actually quite done yet. While we've created a basic, in this case, Generation 2 virtual machine, and you can see it's pretty straightforward, we still have some configuration work to do for this guy. Right now, it may not communicate very well on the network because we haven't set any of those settings up. So we still have some details that we want to get to. So coming up next, we'll get into those details like dynamic memory.